Fix it, and I'll kiss you, the CEO said with a playful smile that made everyone around her laugh, convinced the joke had already found its target. No one imagined that a quiet black single dad standing beside an old red toolbox was only seconds away from changing the way every person in that parking lot would define respect. Some stories begin with wealth. Some begin with power. But the ones people remember begin with character. This is the story of a man who never chased recognition because the only person he wanted to impress was the little girl waiting for him at home. The July sun shimmered above Sterling Mobility's Innovation Campus outside Austin, Texas, baking the blacktop until waves of heat danced across rows of luxury vehicles. Employees gathered around a beautifully restored 1968 Shelby GT500 that had stubbornly refused to start moments before an important investor presentation. Engineers carrying tablets whispered complicated theories. Executives checked expensive watches. Nobody noticed the aging pickup truck rolling quietly into the visitor parking area. Elijah Brooks stepped out wearing faded blue jeans, worn work boots, and a gray work shirt with a stitched patch that simply read Brooks Auto Repair. A faint trace of motor oil stained his sleeves, and his weathered hands carried the calm confidence earned from decades of solving problems no computer could explain. He wasn't famous. He wasn't wealthy. He was simply a father trying to finish one roadside service call before picking up his 12-year-old daughter, Mia, from summer art camp. Victoria Sterling crossed her arms as she watched him approach the silent Mustang. Her tailored ivory blazer and polished heels seemed almost untouched by the Texas heat, yet frustration flickered behind her composed expression. She had built a billion-dollar automotive empire by trusting data, innovation, and elite talent. The sight of a neighborhood mechanic arriving instead of another engineering consultant felt almost amusing. A few executives exchanged knowing smiles. Someone quietly lifted a phone to record what they expected would become another harmless office story. Victoria tilted her head with an amused grin. "Tell you what," she said loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Fix it, and I'll kiss you." Laughter rolled through the crowd like a passing breeze. Elijah didn't laugh. He didn't blush. He didn't answer the challenge. Instead, he placed his weathered toolbox gently on the pavement, rested one hand on the warm hood, closed his eyes for a brief moment, and listened so carefully that even the laughter slowly began to disappear. The silence lingered far longer than anyone expected. It was not the uncomfortable silence of failure. It was the focused quiet that settles over a room when someone truly knows what they are doing. Elijah slowly removed his hand from the hood and walked around the Shelby once without speaking. His eyes followed the body lines, the slight angle where the front tires rested, even the tiny shimmer beneath the chassis where a single drop of fluid reflected the afternoon sun. One engineer folded his arms with a smirk. "You cannot diagnose a modern problem by looking at the paint," he muttered. Another quietly laughed. Elijah never looked up. He knelt beside the front wheel, placed 2 fingers near the lower suspension, then stood again. "Would you mind opening the hood?" he asked politely. Victoria raised an eyebrow. "That is all." "That is enough for now," Elijah answered. She pressed the release inside the cabin, and one of her assistants lifted the hood. The crowd leaned forward. Expensive diagnostic equipment sat untouched inside several engineering carts nearby, but Elijah reached for none of it. Instead, he rested both hands lightly on the fender and listened. The breeze carried the scent of warm asphalt, fresh-cut grass from the landscaped entrance, and faint traces of gasoline drifting from the engine bay. Somewhere across the campus, a flag snapped gently against its pole. Elijah seemed to hear every sound except the impatient whispers surrounding him. "Battery is new," one engineer announced confidently. "Fuel pressure checks out." Another added, "We already scanned every control module twice." Elijah nodded with genuine respect. "I believe you." The simple response caught them off guard. There was no arrogance in his voice, no attempt to prove anyone wrong. Only calm curiosity. He reached into his worn toolbox and removed nothing more sophisticated than a flashlight, a small mechanic's mirror, and a clean shop towel folded with remarkable precision. Victoria watched him carefully now. Something about his movements reminded her of an experienced concert pianist approaching an old grand piano. Every motion was economical. Every pause seemed intentional. He directed the flashlight toward the rear of the engine compartment for only a few seconds before smiling almost imperceptibly. "Interesting," he whispered to himself. One executive chuckled. "Did you find magic in there?" Elijah looked up with kind eyes. "No, sir. Just a conversation someone forgot to finish." Confused glances spread through the group. He gently traced one wiring harness with his fingertips until they stopped near a connector tucked beneath a protective cover. It looked perfectly normal to everyone else. Elijah carefully lifted the connector, rotated it less than an inch, then pressed until a soft click echoed beneath the hood. It was barely audible, but he smiled as though greeting an old friend. "Would you do me one favor?" he asked Victoria. "Please sit in the driver's seat." She hesitated before sliding behind the wheel. "Now what?" she asked. Elijah stepped back, closed the hood with both hands, and nodded once. "Now," he said softly, "turn the key exactly the way you did the first time. Nothing more, nothing less." Around them, the laughter had completely disappeared. Even the phones that had been raised to capture another embarrassing moment slowly lowered. Without realizing it, everyone had stopped waiting for the mechanic to fail. They had begun waiting to see what he already knew. Victoria wrapped her fingers around the ignition key and looked once through the windshield toward Elijah. He gave only a small nod. No dramatic speech. No confident grin. Just quiet assurance. She turned the key exactly as he had instructed. For a brief heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the starter engaged with a clean, confident rhythm. A second later, the Shelby came alive. The legendary V8 engine settled into a deep, perfectly balanced rumble that rolled across the parking lot like distant thunder softened by summer air. The polished chrome exhaust released a smooth, steady note with none of the hesitation that had frustrated the engineering team all morning. Every conversation stopped. Every pair of eyes drifted from the car to the quiet mechanic standing beside it with his hands resting loosely at his sides. Victoria stared at the instrument panel in disbelief. Every warning light had disappeared. Oil pressure was steady. Voltage was exactly where it belonged. She gently pressed the accelerator, and the engine responded instantly with crisp precision. It sounded less like an old machine and more like an orchestra finally finding perfect harmony. One of the senior engineers hurried forward carrying a diagnostic tablet. He connected it beneath the dashboard, watching the screen with growing confusion. No faults. No communication errors. No intermittent failures. Everything reported normal. He disconnected the scanner, plugged it back in, and checked again. The same result. Another engineer whispered, "That is impossible." Elijah smiled politely. "No, sir. It was simply overlooked." Victoria stepped out of the car slowly, her earlier confidence replaced by genuine curiosity. "What did you do?" she asked. Elijah walked toward the open hood once more and gently pointed beneath the protective cover. This connector was seated almost completely, almost as enough to fool every computer in the car. Heat caused the connection to expand just enough to interrupt communication for a fraction of a second. The software believed there was a larger failure because it trusted incomplete information. Several engineers leaned closer. One quietly admitted, "We never thought to inspect that connector because the scan suggested something much deeper." Elijah nodded. Sometimes the loudest problem begins with the quietest detail. The words settled over the group with surprising weight. No one argued. No one searched for excuses. The breeze carried the scent of blooming crepe myrtles planted along the corporate entrance, while the steady idle of the Shelby continued behind them like calm. Breathing after a long struggle, Victoria looked at the mechanic differently now. The teasing smile that had amused her only minutes earlier had completely vanished. In its place was respect mixed with unanswered questions. She noticed the careful way he folded his shop towel before placing it back inside the toolbox. She noticed that every tool had its place. Nothing was scattered. Nothing was rushed. It reminded her of the discipline she expected from her best executives. yet somehow it felt even more authentic. One young intern who had quietly recorded the entire encounter lowered his phone and whispered to a coworker. He never tried to embarrass anyone. The coworker answered just as softly. He did not have to. Elijah checked the time on an inexpensive wristwatch whose scratched crystal revealed years of faithful use. His expression changed ever so slightly. I appreciate the opportunity to help, he said. If everything stays stable during the next few miles, you should not have any more trouble. Victoria blinked. You are leaving already? He gave a warm smile. My daughter finishes art camp in 40 minutes, and I promised I would be there before the doors opened. She always looks for my truck first. For reasons she could not yet explain, those simple words stayed with Victoria far longer than the sound of the engine that everyone else was still admiring. Elijah closed his toolbox with the same quiet care he had shown every step of the afternoon. He thanked the nearest engineer for holding the hood and nodded respectfully to the group before walking toward his weathered pickup. Nobody stopped him. Nobody knew what to say. The parking lot that had echoed with confident opinions only minutes earlier now felt strangely peaceful. Victoria watched him climb into the truck, but instead of driving away immediately, he reached across the passenger seat and picked up a colorful paper bag decorated with bright hand-drawn flowers. Through the windshield, she caught a glimpse of a handwritten note taped to the front. It read, "Good luck at work, Daddy. Love, Mia." Elijah smiled to himself, touched the note gently with one finger, and started the engine. The old pickup pulled away without hurry, disappearing beyond the rows of polished executive vehicles that suddenly looked less impressive than they had an hour before. Victoria remained standing beside the Shelby long after he had left. One of her vice presidents approached carefully. The investors are waiting upstairs. She looked toward the highway where the pickup had vanished. Reschedule the presentation for 30 minutes. He looked surprised. Everything is working now. I know, she answered quietly, but I have the feeling we almost missed something much more valuable than this meeting. Inside the executive conference room, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the entire campus. Fresh coffee filled the air, and digital presentations glowed across massive screens. Yet Victoria barely noticed any of it. Instead, she replayed every moment of the encounter in her mind. Elijah had never criticized her engineers. He had never tried to make himself look smarter. He had solved the problem, protected everyone's dignity, and quietly left to keep a promise to his daughter. That combination unsettled her in the best possible way. During a pause in the meeting, she turned to her executive assistant. Claire, can you find out something for me? Claire nodded. Of course. Brooks Auto Repair. I want to know who Elijah Brooks is. Claire smiled politely. Simple background check? Victoria looked out the window again. No. I do not want gossip. I want facts. Less than an hour later, Claire returned carrying a slim folder. There is almost nothing online, she admitted. No interviews. No social media. No business awards. Victoria frowned slightly. Keep looking. Claire hesitated before sliding one additional page across the desk. I did find one unusual thing. Victoria lowered her eyes to the page. It was an archived automotive engineering journal published nearly 14 years earlier. Buried halfway through the article appeared a familiar name beneath several technical contributors. Elijah Brooks. She looked closer. The article discussed breakthrough thermal management systems for high-performance engines, technology years ahead of its time. Victoria blinked twice. This cannot be the same man. Claire answered softly. I checked the age and hometown. It matches. Victoria continued reading. Several patents were listed beside his name. Others credited him for solving engineering failures that had delayed multimillion-dollar development programs. Then the trail simply ended. No announcement. No retirement. No corporate promotion. It was as though someone had quietly stepped away from one extraordinary life and chosen another without telling the world. Victoria slowly closed the folder. Outside, late afternoon sunlight washed the campus in warm shades of gold, while somewhere miles away a little girl was probably running toward an old pickup with paint on her hands and a smile on her face. For the first time in years, Victoria found herself wondering whether true success was measured by billion-dollar companies or by being exactly where one small heart expected you to be. 3 days passed, and the memory refused to leave Victoria's mind. Board meetings came and went. Investors praised quarterly projections. Engineers presented ambitious designs for the company's next flagship performance vehicle. Yet every polished presentation felt strangely incomplete. She kept remembering a man in worn work boots who had solved a problem without raising his voice or seeking applause. Early Monday morning, Sterling Mobility's Advanced Development Center buzzed with nervous energy. In the middle of the enormous engineering laboratory rested Project Orion, the prototype that represented nearly 4 years of research and hundreds of millions of dollars in investment. Cameras would arrive within 2 weeks. Automotive journalists from across the country had already accepted invitations. If Orion failed, the company's reputation would suffer long before the first customer ever placed an order. Victoria walked slowly around the prototype while dozens of engineers studied live data flowing across enormous display screens. The electric blue sports coupe looked flawless beneath the bright laboratory lights, yet frustration filled every corner of the room. "Run it again," Victoria said calmly. The chief engineer nodded. The startup sequence began. Exactly as designed. Systems initialized. Cooling pumps activated. Battery status remained stable. Then, without warning, the displays flashed yellow before returning to normal. The fault vanished so quickly that it left no useful record. "Again," Victoria said. They repeated the process. The same result. An intermittent failure that appeared for less than half a second before disappearing. Software specialists blamed hardware. Hardware specialists blamed software. Suppliers insisted every component met specifications. The room gradually filled with quiet tension. Nobody wanted to admit they were chasing a problem they could not explain. Victoria folded her arms. Suddenly she remembered another sentence spoken in another parking lot. Sometimes the loudest problem begins with the quietest detail. She looked toward the engineering director. "Has anyone physically inspected every connector involved in the startup sequence?" He answered almost immediately. "The diagnostics show no connector faults." She held his gaze. "That was not my question." The room fell silent. After several uncomfortable seconds, one senior technician quietly admitted, "We trusted the data more than our eyes." Victoria took a slow breath. For the first time in years, she realized how easily brilliant people could become prisoners of their own technology. Later that afternoon, she dismissed the meeting early, something she almost never did. Instead of returning to her executive office, she drove herself across town without security or a company driver. Brooks Auto Repair sat beside an old brick hardware store on a quiet street where oak trees shaded the sidewalks and neighbors still waved to passing cars. The modest garage had 3 service bays, faded blue paint, and flower boxes beneath the front windows that someone had lovingly maintained. There were no expensive signs promising luxury service. No polished showroom. Only the comforting scent of fresh coffee drifting through the open office door and the familiar sound of honest work. Victoria remained inside her car for a moment, watching through the garage entrance. Elijah knelt beside an elderly customer's pickup truck while patiently explaining something with a smile. He did not rush. He did not sell unnecessary repairs. When the older gentleman reached for his wallet, Elijah gently shook his head and handed back several bills. "The part cost less than we expected," he said warmly. "You should keep the difference." The customer looked genuinely surprised before thanking him with grateful eyes. Victoria quietly closed her own car door. Standing on the sidewalk, she suddenly understood something no financial report had ever taught her. Character was not something Elijah turned on when people were watching. It was simply who he was when nobody believed it mattered. Victoria stepped into the garage quietly, expecting Elijah to notice the expensive sedan parked outside before he noticed her. He did not. His attention remained on a young couple whose aging minivan had carried nearly 200,000 miles across Texas roads. He explained the repair in simple language, pointing to the worn part with the patience of a teacher rather than the confidence of a salesman. "You do not need everything replaced today," he said with an easy smile. Drive it for another month, save your money, and when you are ready, we will take care of the rest. The husband looked relieved. His wife squeezed his hand. They thanked Elijah twice before leaving with lighter hearts than when they had arrived. Only then did Elijah wipe his hands on a clean towel and notice Victoria standing near the office door. Surprise crossed his face for only a moment before warmth replaced it. Good afternoon, he said. How is the Mustang? She smiled faintly. Running perfectly. He nodded once. I am glad to hear it. She looked around the modest garage. Old family photographs hung above a workbench. Children's drawings were taped neatly beside framed certificates whose edges had begun to fade with time. A small table near the coffee pot held a half-finished model car covered in bright blue paint. My daughter is building that, Elijah explained after noticing where she was looking. She says every great mechanic should know how to dream before learning how to build. Victoria laughed softly. She sounds wise. She keeps me that way. For a brief moment neither of them spoke. The hum of an air compressor drifted from the back of the shop while wind stirred the American flag hanging outside the open bay door. Finally Victoria took a careful breath. I came because I need your help. Elijah listened without interrupting. Our newest prototype has developed an intermittent fault. The best engineers I have cannot explain it. He folded the towel once before placing it on the bench. And you think I can? I think you see things differently. Elijah smiled gently. Sometimes different is useful. Sometimes it only creates more questions. Victoria met his eyes. Then come ask the questions we forgot to ask. Before he could answer, the front door opened and a cheerful voice echoed through the garage. Daddy! Mia hurried inside carrying a sketchbook almost as large as her backpack. She stopped when she noticed the visitor. Elijah's face brightened instantly. How was art camp? The teacher hung my painting on the wall. She proudly held up a colorful landscape filled with rolling hills, old trucks, and a bright orange sunset. Elijah admired every detail as though it belonged in a museum. I knew you could do it. Mia noticed Victoria watching. Hello. Hello. Mia, Victoria replied warmly. Your father says you are the dreamer around here. Mia grinned. He fixes cars. I fix ideas. Victoria laughed again, this time without the weight she usually carried into every conversation. After Mia disappeared into the office to finish her homework, Victoria looked back at Elijah. Will you at least visit the development center? No contracts. No obligations. Just one afternoon. Elijah rested both hands on the edge of the workbench and glanced toward the office where his daughter quietly colored another page. I stopped chasing big projects a long time ago, he said. Not because I stopped loving engineering, but because I learned there are things more valuable than recognition. Victoria nodded with understanding. I am not asking you to chase anything. I am asking you to help people who have forgotten how to listen. Elijah remained quiet for several seconds, his eyes following Mia as she sat in. The office carefully adding another splash of blue to her painting. The afternoon sunlight spilled through the dusty front windows, wrapping the little garage in a warm golden glow that reminded him why he had never regretted choosing this simpler life. Finally, he looked back at Victoria. One afternoon, he said calmly. After that, I come back here. Relief crossed her face. That is all I am asking. The next morning, Elijah arrived at Sterling Mobility just after sunrise. Instead of the worn work shirt he normally wore in the garage, he had chosen a neatly pressed blue button-down, though his old work boots remained unchanged. Several employees recognized him immediately from the parking lot incident. This time, however, nobody laughed. Conversations softened as he walked through the research center. Engineers stepped aside without being asked. Respect had quietly replaced curiosity. Victoria met him outside the prototype laboratory. Thank you for coming. Elijah smiled. Let us see what the car is trying to tell us. Inside the laboratory, Project Orion rested beneath bright white lights, surrounded by computer stations displaying streams of technical data. The engineering director immediately began explaining months of testing, thermal simulations, software revisions, and sensor calibration reports. Elijah listened politely for several minutes before gently raising one hand. "May I ask a question?" "Of course," the director replied. "When did the problem first appear?" 3 weeks ago." "What changed 3 weeks ago?" The room became still. Several engineers glanced at one another. One answered, "We updated the startup control software." Another added, "We also switched suppliers for one section of the cooling assembly." Elijah nodded thoughtfully. "Anything else?" Silence followed. Finally, a younger engineer quietly admitted, "We adjusted the routing of one wiring harness to improve assembly speed." Elijah smiled kindly. "Now we are getting somewhere." He walked slowly around the prototype without touching it. His eyes moved from panel gaps to cooling ducts, from mounting brackets to electrical connectors. Then he surprised everyone by kneeling beside the front wheel instead of opening the hood. He remained there for nearly a full minute, studying a narrow section where several systems passed through the chassis together. The laboratory became so quiet that the faint hum of the air conditioning sounded unusually loud.
Victoria noticed something familiar.
It was exactly the same silence that had settled over the parking lot days earlier. Elijah finally stood and looked toward the engineering team. "Please begin the startup sequence." The systems activated exactly as before. Displays illuminated. Pumps engaged. Then, for the briefest instant, the warning flashed across the monitors before disappearing. Elijah did not look at the screens. Instead, he watched a single cable housing vibrate almost imperceptibly near the front suspension. "Again," he said softly. They repeated the test. The same tiny movement appeared. Barely noticeable. Easy to ignore. Elijah nodded once. "Please stop." He walked over to the engineering director and asked, "Who approved relocating that harness?" A nervous silence spread across the room. One senior engineer slowly raised his hand. "I did." It reduced installation time by nearly 4 minutes per vehicle. Elijah smiled without judgment. It also placed the harness close enough to a structural vibration that every few hundred startup cycles, one signal becomes unstable for less than half a second. The software is not your problem. The connector is not your problem. The design philosophy is your problem. You optimized for assembly speed before protecting communication stability. Nobody spoke. Even the engineers who had spent months defending their theories lowered their eyes. Victoria looked around the laboratory and realized that no one felt humiliated. They felt enlightened. Elijah had not exposed anyone's weakness. He had simply reminded them that the smallest compromise, made for the right reason but without complete understanding, could quietly become the loudest failure of all. The laboratory remained silent for several long moments before the engineering director slowly walked toward the prototype and examined the wiring harness Elijah had identified. He requested a magnified inspection camera, and within minutes the enlarged image appeared across every display in the room. The cable housing showed faint polishing marks where repeated vibration had caused microscopic movement against its protective guide. It was almost invisible to the naked eye. One senior engineer quietly exhaled. "We checked that area dozens of times." Elijah nodded gently. "You were looking for failure. You should have been looking for conversation. Machines tell us what they need. We simply have to become patient enough to listen." Nobody smiled at the unusual phrase. Instead, several engineers began taking notes. They no longer saw Elijah as an outsider. They saw a teacher. Victoria watched the room transform before her eyes. People who had spent weeks defending competing theories were suddenly working together without pride getting in the way. The revised harness was secured in a new position, additional insulation was installed, and the startup sequence began again. Once, twice, 10 times, 20 times. Every cycle completed perfectly. The warning never returned. A quiet wave of relief swept through the laboratory, followed by something even more meaningful: respect. Not the loud applause that often follows success, but the quiet respect earned when excellence arrives wrapped in humility. The engineering director approached Elijah with genuine gratitude. "Would you consider leading a consulting team for us? We could build an entire department around your experience." Elijah smiled with kindness. I appreciate the offer, but I already lead the most important team in my life. He glanced at the family photograph displayed on his phone, where Mia stood proudly beside an old fishing pier, holding up a tiny bluegill she had caught the previous spring. She still expects me home for dinner. Several people laughed softly, not because the answer was amusing, but because it reminded them of something they had neglected in their own busy lives. As employees slowly returned to their workstations, Victoria walked beside Elijah toward the parking garage. The afternoon sun filtered through the glass walls, casting long golden reflections across the polished floor. You walked away from patents, recognition, and opportunities that most people spend their entire lives chasing, she said quietly. Do you ever regret it? Elijah considered the question before answering. When my wife passed away, Mia needed a father more than the world needed another engineer. Every decision after that became surprisingly simple. Victoria lowered her eyes for a moment. She had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions with complete confidence. Yet that single sentence reached a place inside her that success never had. They stepped outside into the warm Texas air. Elijah opened the door of his old pickup, but before climbing inside he turned back toward her. May I ask you something?
Victoria nodded.
Why did you really come to my garage instead of sending another executive? She smiled honestly. Because I realized the person who solved my car without making anyone feel small might also know how to solve a company that had slowly forgotten the difference between intelligence and wisdom. Elijah gave a quiet smile that reached his eyes. Then you already solved the hardest problem yourself. As he drove away beneath a sky painted with soft shades of orange and blue, Victoria remained standing in the parking lot, watching the old pickup disappear into evening traffic. For the first time in many years, she did not feel inspired by extraordinary technology or remarkable profits. She felt inspired by the quiet strength of a man who had chosen family over fame, dignity over recognition, and kindness over the need to prove he was right. Autumn arrived quietly across central Texas, carrying cooler mornings and golden leaves that drifted along the sidewalks outside Brooks Auto Repair. Life settled back into its familiar rhythm. Elijah repaired family sedans, pickup trucks, and aging farm equipment with the same steady patience he had always shown. Mia filled the office walls with new paintings, each one brighter than the last. The television in the waiting room occasionally mentioned Sterling Mobility's successful launch of Project Orion, praising its engineering excellence and record-breaking investor response. Elijah simply smiled whenever customers congratulated him, then returned to tightening bolts or wiping his hands with the same folded shop towel. He had never needed his name in the headlines to know he had done something worthwhile. One crisp Saturday afternoon, as sunlight poured across the quiet street, a familiar Shelby GT500 rolled slowly into the garage parking lot. Its engine purred with smooth confidence. Victoria stepped out wearing simple blue jeans and a light sweater instead of a tailored executive suit. There were no security vehicles, no photographers, and no assistants following behind her. In her hand, she carried a small picnic basket rather than a business folder. Elijah looked up from replacing the brakes on an old pickup and smiled. Everything still running well? She laughed softly. Better than ever. Mia came running from the office carrying another finished painting.
Miss Victoria.
Victoria knelt to admire the colorful picture. It showed an old pickup truck parked beside a shining sports car beneath a huge Texas sunset. 3 smiling figures stood between them holding hands. That is beautiful, Victoria whispered. Mia grinned. It is about people becoming friends. Elijah walked over, wiping his hands. Victoria stood and looked at him with the same calm honesty he had taught everyone around her. Do you remember something I said the first day we met? Elijah chuckled quietly. I remember. She shook her head with an embarrassed smile. I thought confidence meant always having the cleverest words. He answered gently. Sometimes it just means being willing to become a better person. She stepped a little closer, her expression warm with gratitude rather than pride. Then allow me to keep one promise. She gave him a brief, respectful kiss on the cheek, simple and heartfelt, while Mia clapped her hands with delighted laughter. Elijah smiled, slightly surprised, then looked toward the old Shelby. "You know," he said with an easy grin. "Fixing the car turned out to be the easy part." Victoria laughed through grateful eyes. "You were never repairing the car. You were repairing the way I looked at people." The afternoon breeze carried the scent of fresh coffee, motor oil, and autumn leaves as the three of them shared sandwiches beside the garage instead of talking about business. Passing neighbors waved. Customers smiled. Nobody there cared who owned a billion-dollar company or who drove an old pickup. They simply saw three good people enjoying an ordinary afternoon together. And perhaps that was the greatest miracle of all. Real greatness rarely arrives with flashing lights or loud applause. More often, it appears in quiet dignity, humble hands, promises faithfully kept, and the simple courage to treat every person with respect long before discovering who they really are.